Have you ever wondered why economists love GDP so much? Why not any other economic indicator? In my last video, I explained why the large gap in GDP per capita between Europe and the United States isn't necessarily painting the full picture, and I've received a ton of comments that are extremely critical of GDP as a whole. There seems to be a pretty widespread belief that GDP is useless, and a lot of commenters suggest some other metrics that we should use instead. And while I agree that GDP has its flaws, there's also a reason it continues to be one of our main macroeconomic indicators. So in this video, I want to give a bit more of a balanced view of GDP. I'll go into some of the main criticisms, but also give a fair explanation of its strengths and why it's still so commonly used as an indicator. But before we start with that, I want to give a brief explanation of what GDP actually is. The gross domestic product, or GDP for short, is a monetary measure of the total market value of all the final goods and services which are produced and rendered during a specific period of time by a country or region. So essentially, the value of all the stuff produced in a country in some given time frame, usually a year. It's primarily a measure of output, and its major components are as follows. There's consumption. This is all the stuff that you use to fulfill your present needs or desires, like food, a new phone, but also more abstract things like paying rent. Then there's investment, which is all about the future. When you save money or buy stocks, your savings eventually end up in companies that buy new machines for production, which is then counted as investment in GDP. The third aspect is government spending, which represents money the government spends on goods and services. This covers a huge range of activities, from building infrastructure like roads, bridges and schools, to paying salaries of teachers, police officers and military. And finally, the last piece is the trade balance. It is calculated by taking the total value of goods and services that a country sells to other nations, so exports, and subtracting the value of goods and services it buys from abroad, so imports. So now that we know what we're dealing with, let's jump into the interesting part. Why do people dislike it so much? Most of the criticisms boil down to the claim that GDP is a bad measure of welfare. And since ultimately we should build societies that maximize welfare and not output, GDP is a bad metric to guide us there. The list of failings in this regard is very long, and I don't aim to cover them all here, but mostly just give an overview of the most impactful ones. So don't consider this list exhaustive, and also I should say it's not in any particular order. That being said, let's get into it. Let's start with the issue that was probably most often mentioned in my comment section, and that was distributional issues. GDP doesn't in any way account for the actual distribution of those resources. So this means a country with a high GDP could theoretically have all those resources in the hands of just a few very rich oligarchs, which is obviously very bad for general welfare. Over the last few decades, income inequality has increased worldwide, but the trend is even more pronounced in the US, where it has been pretty drastic. This graph shows the pre- and post-tax income share of the top 1% US earners. As you can see, since the start of the measurement, the income share of the top 1% has been gradually declining, up until about the 1980s, where this trend reverses. By 2014, their pre-tax share of the national income is basically up to the highest level it's ever been. Over the same period, the real US GDP has been steadily rising. It goes from around $15,000 at the start of 1947 to around $32,500 in quarter one of 1981, which corresponds to a gain of around 113%. In the following period of the same length, GDP rises to around $58,000, an increase of around 78%. Smaller, but still very significant. Now remember that the first of these two periods saw a relatively stable or slowly declining income inequality, whereas the second one saw a rapid increase in inequality. Let's now take a look at the distribution of pre- and post-tax income growth over the same two periods. If we compare the post-tax income growth of the full population to the bottom 50%, we see that in the period from 1946 to 1980, the bottom 50%'s income has actually grown faster than that of the full population, with 130% to 95%. When we look at the period from 1980 to 2014, we see that this trend has completely reversed, with the bottom 50%'s income growing only a mere 21% versus the 61% of the overall population. That means that the bottom 50% of income earners have essentially been left behind over the last couple decades, especially when you compare it to the top 0.001%, who've seen their income grow 617% over the same period. In this case, GDP obviously fails to do a good job of measuring the welfare of the average person. But enough about inequality. Another big issue is that GDP fails to accurately account for leisure time. When you ask people on their deathbed what their biggest regrets are, they seldomly say, "I wish I had spent more time working." There may be some people who truly live to work and enjoy it that way, but most people would probably rather be doing other things given the choice. Societies which succeed in providing their citizens with many highly enjoyable and inexpensive ways to spend their free time will, as a consequence of this, also have their citizens choose more free time over working more for a higher income. And while this is something that's highly desirable for societies, GDP will not only not show this, it will actually go down. If everything else stayed equal, and a society would make free time more enjoyable, as a result, people would work less and GDP would actually decrease. So this is another obvious case in which GDP not only doesn't capture welfare, but actively works against it. The relative attractiveness of free time is of course not the only thing that affects the amount of hours worked. There's a lot of other factors in that equation. But the problem remains, GDP can't account for any of it, and the differences between countries can be quite drastic in this metric. This graph shows the annual working hours per worker for South Korea, the United States and Germany. And I choose these three countries to show you that not only can the levels be quite different, but also the historical developments. You can easily see that this would have a massive effect on GDP, as the average German worker works only about 70% as much as the average South Korean worker. Another common critique of GDP is that it fails to account for what is called defensive expenditures. If your mind immediately goes to big military budgets, you're not actually far off. Defensive expenditures are expenditures which are required to maintain the functioning of society, but which do not by themselves enhance welfare. So, to stick with the military example, a country which is surrounded by hostile neighbors will need to invest a lot in its military, which will keep it safe, but it will not increase welfare apart from that. If you compare it to a country with the same output, but peaceful relations with its neighbors, they can obviously spend a lot more of their resources on welfare-enhancing things. Similarly, a society with high criminality will spend a lot more on policing and incarceration, and cultures with unhealthier lifestyles will need to spend a lot more on healthcare. There are endless examples of this, but there's really not an easy way to account for them in GDP. In a similar vein, GDP does a really bad job of accounting for government-provided services. Now, as we discussed before, these services do factor into GDP through government spending or G, but because they oftentimes don't have a market price, they are accounted for as the cost of their inputs. This means that we're simply assuming that the value people get from consuming these services is equal to the cost of producing them. In many markets that might be reasonable, but in places such as education or healthcare, the value can diverge significantly from the cost. A government that provides excellent healthcare and education at half the cost of its neighbors will have a correspondingly lower GDP. Another big cultural factor that can impact GDP is the rate of marketization for traditional household production. What this means is that goods and services which are historically produced within the household, such as cooking, cleaning, childcare, can be outsourced to varying degrees. So, a society in which it's typical for one partner to specialize in household production and don't go to work will have a lot lower of a GDP than a society in which both partners work, but productivity is otherwise the same. These last few points aren't exactly standardized metrics, so I can't just show you a country comparison or something, but I did find a paper that estimates the welfare impact of many of the topics we've already discussed. The graph on screen is essentially how much each of these factors contributes to welfare. I wanted to show it so we get some idea of how important each of these categories end up being. The graph shows nicely that consumption and unpaid work, so this is the traditional household production, have the largest positive impact on welfare, and that broad ecological costs, which we've yet to get to, and inequality are the biggest negative contributaries, but they're a lot smaller than consumption, for example. It also shows that non-defensive government expenditures and defensive expenditures are both relatively insignificant in the grand scheme. Another problem with GDP is that it doesn't take into account capital depreciation. If a country's economy is based around a product that requires high amounts of rapidly depreciating capital to produce, they will need higher levels of investment to sustain that production. For an example, think about the current computing investments. While it might be highly productive, the tech is still very new and so it's moving quite fast. An investment made today could be made obsolete within only a couple years. And while investment does factor into GDP, as we've seen from our equation, it does nothing for today's consumption, which is what we care about in a welfare context. And so it's possible to have two countries with the same GDP, but because one of them has a higher rate of capital depreciation, that country has to permanently spend more just to keep its capital stock constant. And so they have less resources for consumption and thus less welfare. Think about an economy that focuses on providing financial services, for example. They will need drastically lower amounts of capital, and so they can dedicate a lot more of their resources to consumption. And while it's possible to correct for this, that's what the net domestic product is, by the way, it's pretty hard to estimate, and so it's used a lot less often. I want to illustrate this with a graph real quick. So what you can see here is the real GDP per capita of China and Mexico. And as you can see, China has, over the last couple decades, rapidly caught up to Mexico to the point of even overtaking it somewhere in the last few years. The situation is a little bit deceiving though, as China has a much more capital-intensive economy compared to Mexico. And so their capital depreciation per capita is almost twice as high as Mexico's. This leads to the situation that if we calculate their net domestic product, which is their gross domestic product minus the capital depreciation, Mexico is actually still a bit ahead of China. I know this doesn't look particularly significant on this graph, but this is actually more than a 10% difference, which is certainly enough to feel it. This is also probably the best part to briefly talk about the broad ecological costs, because natural resources of your country, and that could be resources in the ground or just a nice forest, are part of your country's capital, even though they're not recorded as such. So when you cut down this nice forest to use it as fuel, for example, this is obviously consumed, so it ends up in GDP, but any other effects that you lose from this are not recorded. So if people were enjoying the forest recreationally by hiking or walking their dog, and now it's gone, you don't really see that welfare loss anywhere in GDP. Or if the burning of the forest as fuel has introduced a lot of pollution that hurts people down the line, this is also not recorded in GDP. So obviously GDP also fails to account properly for the ecological side of things. And as we've seen in the graph I showed before, depending on the estimate, the effect of this can be quite large. There's also the fact that GDP is highly sensitive to what's called base erosion and profit shifting, which is essentially a tax avoidance strategy mostly used by big multinational corporations. I'm specifically looking at you, Ireland. This is not what normal GDP growth looks like. And the last issue, for this video at least, is that when comparing two countries' GDP, you obviously need to bring them to the same currency. And that means exchange rates can have a massive distortion on your GDP numbers. There is generally a correction for this, called purchasing power parity, or PPP for short, but corrections like these are never perfect and quite often subject to some dispute. If you're interested in this specific part in more depth, I explained it in a bit more detail in my recent video on the US and EU GDP per capita gap. I don't want to reiterate here, so if you're interested, go watch that. Okay, we're finally through with the flaws, but let me just quickly summarize because that was a lot. The claim is that GDP does a bad job measuring welfare because it fails to account for the following factors: inequality, so how resources are distributed in the society; leisure and working hours, how much free time people actually have to enjoy life; defensive expenditures, how much you need to spend simply to live a normal life; government services, so things which some but not all governments provide like healthcare or higher education; household production and how much of it is outsourced; depreciation and how much investment you need to keep up your production; tax evasion, and the effects of exchange rates. I hope this got the point across that GDP is by no means a perfect measure, far from it. But this raises the question, if GDP has all these pitfalls and shortcomings, why do we still use it? Well, there's a couple of arguments, but bear with me, it's not going to be nearly as long as the flaws section. The first common argument is that GDP measures output. And while output isn't exactly welfare, it's certainly a component of it. It's common sense that people enjoy consuming things. I mean, people like driving fast cars or going on nice vacations. And generally, the critique of consumerism isn't that it's boring and tedious. You can also see this empirically by seeing that when people's income goes up, they generally don't reduce their work hours correspondingly, and instead they opt to consume more. So in this graph, the blue line represents the real average weekly wages in the United Kingdom from 1750 to 2015. We can see here that since the year 1800, the real wages have actually risen almost 20-fold. Yet we don't work a 20th of what we did back then. And I mean, this makes sense. It turns out that cars, modern medicine, electricity, running water, and maybe the occasional vacation to Spain are actually nice things, and they're worth working a few more hours for. I bet you also wouldn't want to go back to the 1800s in terms of living standards, even if it meant you only had to work 2 hours a week. So, using this logic, we can actually argue that GDP does a decent job at representing our welfare, especially over the long run. And this also leads us to our second argument, because for now we've only talked about consumption in the stereotypical sense, but we as a society collectively decide how to use resources for other things as well. And while we may not always get it right, we generally try our best to spend those resources on things that we consider to be good. Like, for example, researching treatments of cancer. I want to show you this with a couple of graphs. So what you see here is the GDP per capita on the x-axis and the life expectancy on the y-axis. And all these different bubbles are countries. What I'll show you in a second is the development of this over time. So what you'll generally see is that as GDP per capita gets higher, so does the life expectancy. So as a general rule, all these bubbles will move up and to the right. And this isn't exclusive to life expectancy. We can see the same thing happening with child mortality. As GDP per capita increases, that is, the bubbles moving right on the graph, child mortality also falls, meaning the bubbles move down on the graph. And what do you think will happen to the occurrence rate of extreme poverty? Yep, as countries get richer and move to the right, the occurrence rate of extreme poverty falls drastically. We could continue doing this for all kinds of different general wellness indicators, but I think you get my point. Just to be extra clear here, I'm not saying that GDP necessarily causes all these things, but it also doesn't need to. As long as it tracks them well, it's useful as an indicator, and it seems to do that. If you're interested in more of them, you can head over to gapminder.org. It's the tool I use to create these visualizations, and it's really easy. You can just plug it in and play it. I've put a link in the description. Anyway, the main point here is that while GDP isn't exactly a welfare indicator, it is so heavily correlated with most welfare indicators that we can think of that it actually does a better job of measuring overall welfare than any of the other indicators would do on their own. Essentially, it's just one of the best single number representations that we can create. And if you're wondering why this is the case, it isn't just coincidence. Naturally, societies that have more resources available to them can also spend more of those resources to fix the problems that reduce welfare. This mechanism is the reason why across countries GDP tends to correlate so heavily with all the welfare indicators. Because even though no country will get all of these issues correct, in general people try to spend the resources to enhance their welfare. And apart from these more conceptual points, there's also one massive practical strength of GDP. And that is that GDP is standardized, that it's an aggregate variable, and that it's relatively invariant with different economic institutions. And by the way, we shouldn't take this for granted. Most economic indicators don't have these strengths. And there is a reason the concept was so rapidly adapted after Simon Kuznets came up with it less than 100 years ago. Okay, but let's actually dive into what I mean with these three things. So the first one was standardized. And as you can imagine, there is a ton of different ways countries can measure basically any economic variable. The nice thing about GDP is that it's somewhat standardized according to the system of national accounts. It's not 100%, but it's generally really close and much closer than most other economic variables. One of my favorite ways in which GDP isn't entirely standardized is that at some point EU countries decided that they want to include illegal production in their GDP figures. So now there actually is an official guideline on how you estimate the drug and prostitution output of your country, and it is added onto your GDP. So we know that in Italy, for example, between 1 and 1.1% of your GDP is actually just drugs and prostitution. And the Americans, for example, decided they don't want to add this on top of their GDP. So technically in Italy, the estimates are biased upwards a little bit compared to the US in this regard. Okay, but I got sidetracked. The main point is that it's more standardized than other metrics. The second big advantage here is that it's aggregate. This means you don't really need to collect data on an individual level like you would need to if you wanted to know about distributional metrics, for example. For the most part, you can go off standard administrative data flows, and it relies a lot less on imputations and surveys and microtext data compared to other metrics. This is a big advantage because it will generally be available much quicker and be much easier to calculate. And the last big practical advantage of GDP is that it remains relatively comparable even when the economic and institutional structures of two countries differ vastly. This is because it generally focuses on output, which is a lot less complicated than how the income, for example, could be structured in a country or which services exactly are provided by the government. Okay, so let me summarize the strengths here real quick. First of all, production, and maybe more specifically consumption, is a really big part of welfare, and GDP does a good job measuring that. The second point is that all the things that go into welfare that have nothing to do with consumption still tend to correlate really heavily with GDP, so it also does an okay job measuring this. And the third point is that GDP is just massively more standardized and practical to measure. So it's just a really easy single figure metric that we can use if you want a quick comparison. So put all this together and you'll have a really hard time finding another indicator that's as useful as GDP, but also as convenient and standardized and easy to measure. Okay, so now we know a bit about the flaws and strengths of GDP, but where does this actually leave us? Are the faults bad enough that we should simply disregard GDP and never use it? Or is it actually the best choice out of a set of flawed options? Here's what I would say. If you're primarily interested in measuring welfare, GDP obviously has many shortfalls. Welfare is an incredibly complicated topic, and any attempt to measure it with a single number, such as GDP, is bound to be severely limited. That being said, GDP is still an incredibly powerful metric to measure output, and output often is significant by itself. First of all, sometimes we might just care about output. Second of all, it is a really good measure of consumption, which is a big component of welfare, and it correlates heavily with most other measures of welfare. In the end, I think some of the skepticism towards GDP as a measure of welfare is actually deserved, but I don't think it can be dismissed outright. I also think that some of that skepticism spills over to areas in which GDP is actually a perfectly valid measurement. Not all discussions always need to be about welfare, some of them might simply be about productivity or output. So, if you take only one thing away from this video, let it be this. I would caution against dismissing GDP outright. It definitely has its merits, but when personal well-being is the primary goal, I would be highly skeptical of anyone who tries to present GDP as their sole metric of choice without supplementing it with additional data. Alright, that's it for this one. This video became a lot longer than I initially thought it would be, so if you're still sticking around, then thank you. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I usually try my best to answer them. At this point, I also want to say thank you for the response to my last video. I can't respond to all the comments individually, but it makes me really happy to see how many people enjoyed the video enough to leave a comment and tell me, and also how many people stayed to discuss the topic in the comments. Anyway, see you in the next one.